Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to go through and do a tier ranking of Sanderson's Cosmere books. I'm primarily sticking to his full-length novels, but I do have a few of the novellas and shorter works mixed in, and that would include Secret History, Edge Dancer, Dawn Shard, and Emperor's Soul. Otherwise though, we're looking at primarily his full-length novels, which now that we've had the secret projects, we have a few additional ones to mix in here. And also I did a reread of pretty much all of these books starting at the end of 2022 when I reread through Mistborn leading up to The Lost Metal, and then all of 2023 I've been reading through Stormlight Archive and Warbreaker, Elantris, so just kind of getting a refresher on basically all things Cosmere. And I thought it'd be fun, now that I've done that reread and we had the Year of Sanderson, to go back through and kind of re-examine my feelings towards the Cosmere books. So I'm gonna start, as I am wont to do, with the middle tier. I like working my way from the middle tier so that we get to the extremes, both in negative and positive at the end. And I will say I almost felt the need to have more than just your basic 5 tiers, because some of these are not equal. Some of them within the same tier, I like one of them way more than the other, but I couldn't justify putting it in the tier above, and I couldn't justify putting the other ones in the tier below. But just know that not everything within the exact same tiers are the same feelings. Some of them you get it. So let's jump into it, starting with the middle tier. I'm going to go ahead and put the Alloy of Law in this middle tier. Second Era Mistborn is not my favorite of the Cosmere books, just all around. I think that it definitely leans into the campy and adventurous side, which isn't to say that there's not great character development, great exploration of the characters and relationship building. Also, the expansion of the magic system in Era 2 is really awesome. However, I just prefer I wouldn't say the doom and gloom that is Era 1. I don't always prefer doom and gloom. Sometimes I want that more adventurous feel. But I think the characters themselves, none of them really ever impacted me the same way that the characters from Era 1 and also some of the other Cosmere works did. I just don't have that really strong connection to them. I do like the setting. I think it's so different from what we are accustomed to in fantasy, but overall, Era 2, it's just kind of hard for it in general to break out of this middle tier. There's one in here that is elsewhere, but basically all of Era 2 is in this middle tier. I started with the Alloy of Law, but actually Bands of Mourning and The Lost Metal are here as well. When I first read The Lost Metal, I wondered if it was my favorite in the series because it is so explosive. You do have things from earlier Era 2 books that lead up to it that you didn't even realize were going to play a role in this one. And I liked that about The Lost Metal. I liked the action scenes as well. I thought some of them were kind of campy, but in a really fun way. And I thought they played into a lot of action tropes, and once again, in a fun way. I think he did something really cool with them. But the same character that kind of brings the series down overall had a moment that could have been really moving, and instead it just became really ridiculous, and that really, really took it down. It wasn't just that moment, but in general, that character, they're not my favorite, and they were a little more prominent in that 4th book, and it's tough when a character just isn't quite your cup of tea. Bands of Mourning, I don't know what it is, but even when I reread it, I kept feeling like I forget what happens in this one. I don't know why, because there's some really cool moments, and some of the almost Indiana Jones feel to Bands of Mourning is really cool, and I enjoy it a lot. But for whatever reason, this one is just kind of the least memorable to me, and it kind of deviates a bit from the feel of the others. And that's a good thing and a bad thing, but I think it contributes to why I find this one forgettable. I suppose for some people that exact thing could make this one more memorable to them because it stands out a little differently, unless you disagree and you feel like they all feel similarly. But Bands of Mourning is just not as memorable. So for that reason, it's also in the middle tier. As for the others in this tier, Elantris, I think rereading it, I liked Elantris more. I also feel though that Elantris comes across like Sanderson still finding his footing as far as establishing his voice, and specifically establishing his voice separate from his predecessors and his inspirations. I think his voice is not as distinct in Elantris. I think that he doesn't lean as strong into his characters. They feel a little more cookie cutter in some ways. Elantris's characters, which I actually like them, Serene in particular, I really like her. I think Raoden is a very inspirational character, but they feel like a blueprint for his future characters in a lot of ways. It's funny because I actually feel like Serene feels like a blueprint for Shallan, but I like Serene more, but I feel like we dissect Shallan a lot more, which I like. And then Raoden in some ways feels like a blueprint for a few of Sanderson's characters, like in some ways Kelsier as far as the hopeful character, or Adolin with the like, oh, they're so likable, everybody can't help but be swept away in their charm and that kind of thing. But they just don't have that same level of depth that I have come to love about the Mistborn Era 1 characters and the Stormlight Archive characters. Plus the plot, the villain, I think, had the potential to be one of my favorite antagonists, but I don't feel that we got as much of them as I would have liked to really bring them to that level, because they're actually extremely morally gray. And there's some reveals toward the end that I don't think are foreshadowed and set up as well as some of his other works. So Elantris is still a good book, in my opinion, and I still really like it, and I like the premise, I like the characters. It just doesn't quite hit yet. It feels like an earlier work, which I hate saying that, because if I didn't know it was an earlier work, a part of me is like, would I ever say that? So I guess I can't really ever know that, but it feels that way in some regards. I also am putting Emperor's Soul here. I think Emperor's Soul feels like a crucial part of the Cosmere. It feels like so many of the magic systems combined in a way, and I like our main character and how creative she is and how innovative she is, and in some ways mischievous at the same time, but knows when to show her hand and when to keep her cards close. So I really like her. But it's just so short, and it's hard to feel as strongly for her and her story, and to really feel like I'm seeing the magic system at its fullest within such a short amount of time, especially with how complex the magic is in this one. But I still quite liked Emperor's Soul. If it's not clear, I quite liked everything in this middle category, and that is true for this last one, which I almost debated putting this one higher because I think I like it more than some of the others, but then when comparing it to the ones that are in the second tier, I was like, oh, I just don't like it as much as as any of them, and that would be Tress. I really like Tress. Tress is wonderful. It's delightful. I think that the play on the Princess Bride story was done really well. I think that it had that typical Sanderson flair, and in this case, really extremely so, where you see the spores are just so life or death and unique and interesting. The sense of adventure and whimsy is great, but I am on repeat a little bit here. I don't know that the depth was quite to the level that my favorites from Sanderson are, and for that reason, pretty much in that reason alone, that is why Tress is in this middle category. If we'd gotten a little bit more to it, I think it would have been higher, but it wouldn't have been Tress if we'd had that, because Tress is kind of adventurous and fun and heartwarming, and it feels like something your whole family can love, and I kind of want some of the devastation, and I don't want that in Tress though. It's just that's what tends to take things, is I want the extreme highs and lows in my favorites, and Tress is primarily a fun high, which I like. I think those books are important. I really love books like that. It's just they're not ultimately usually my all-time favorites. Now, let's deviate from there and go into the second tier and the fourth tier. So I'm going to start with that second tier and say that Shadows of Self, since I talked about Era 2 a lot, Shadows of Self is the one Mistborn Era 2 book that really is bumped up for me. I think that the reveals that you get in that are really masterfully done. They're unexpected because there is this mystery in the second book, and then you realize that the mystery is not contained to the second book, which I thought was awesome. It's a really heartbreaking reveal. I feel like that devastation I was just talking about, you actually kind of feel that for the main character Waxilium in that second book, which I really liked. And I just in general find that the second one just has so much of that almost detective noir Batman feel, and I really like that a lot. So Shadows of Self is the one Era 2 book that is much higher up, I would say. We also have Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. I have such a soft spot for this. I really do like the development of the characters and the exploration of what they've endured in their lives, how to press on through what they have gone through, the mistakes they've made in the past, or the things that were forced upon them. I love the clashing of these different worlds and perspectives. I think that the relationship building is precious. I think that the way that he shows that you can't really judge a book by its cover with not just the main characters, but the side characters was done really well. The magic is interesting. The feeling of sci fantasy was unlike what I've seen, not just from a lot of other fantasy, but even a lot of what I've seen from Sanderson. And then, of course, I have said this many a time, but the inspirations from Final Fantasy X were just the right amount. Chef's kiss, loved them. So that was really great to see. Going down to the 4th tier, I'm just going to get this out of the way because I know it's probably the most unpopular opinion on this list, but I'm putting Oathbringer in this 4th tier. I think on first read, Oathbringer would have been in the 3rd tier. It's never been my favorite Stormlight book, but on reread, I liked it less, and the pacing was the primary reason. I just feel like the things that we focus on are astounding to me when there's so many other things that I feel like are really interesting, and we kind of just either brush through those things, or they're mentioned having occurred in a paragraph, or they don't get a lot of time, and then the things that I don't care about as much get tons of time. And the way in which characters are kept apart from each other is not my favorite, because there's a whole, I don't want to spoil it for anybody that hasn't read it, but there's a whole section of Oathbringer where the characters go somewhere that is interesting, and it's unfortunate because it's like they're not there long enough for us to really explore this interesting place, but they're also there too long in that I'm like, okay, can we just like get out of here already? Especially because of that, the characters are all apart from each other for, not every single character, but important characters are kept apart for a while as a result of this place, and just the timing of it. It's important, but it feels like it's important for future things and less so for the things in this book, and it just has some aspects to it that are not my favorite. So pacing is a big thing. Also, the Sanderlanche that a lot of us have come to love from not just the Stormlight Archive, but Sanderson's books in general. This one had the least amount of emotional impact of all of them. Like Rhythm of War, Words of Radiance, and Way of Kings. All of them, they're Sanderlanches. I'm edge of my seat, not just because of the suspense of the action, but because my heart is worried. I'm like, nobody better die. Nobody better get hurt. I need to make sure that my Spren are okay, and that my heroes are okay. And like, I have all these feelings. And then in Oathbringer, it's really explosive, but I don't really care as much about what's happening, because in the first one there is this huge, oh my god, like the we have to go back feeling. I get so emotional just thinking about it. And then in Rhythm of War, you really are so worried about your characters. You don't know what they're gonna do, and it feels like the end of an arc in some ways for one of the characters, and that arc feels very much tied to the first book, but also their journey through the first 4 books. And so that conclusion feels so emotionally gutting. In Words of Radiance also, it's less that it's emotional in that I'm worried, and it's more just awesome. You get some of the best moments in that. So Oathbringer just didn't have that for me the same way, and it's Sanderlanche. But the pacing issues really are the thing I want to emphasize. It's just not my favorite of the Stormlight Archive books. So it's here in this 4th tier. Moving up and sticking to Stormlight, Words of Radiance is in the 2nd tier. I know for a lot of people, Words of Radiance is their favorite. It does have probably the most quotable of moments. It has some really amazing moments. You're finally seeing worlds collide, characters coming together, characters getting to know each other. You're seeing the way that certain characters they feel like they can't trust anybody, they're starting to open up, but then they question, and the societal norms are being broken down, which is very necessary in the Stormlight Archive, but I just don't love it enough for it to break into that top. I think because, and this is probably really all it comes down to, is there's actually 2 things I should say. The main character that's focused on in Words of Radiance, while I think their backstory is done exceptionally well, I don't love that character as much as I love the character who's explored in Way of Kings. But then also there's a plot line of, in video games, sorry if you don't, but some video games start you off with all your powers, and you're like, whoa, I'm awesome. And then something happens, and then all your powers are taken away, and you like slowly build your character back up, and you're like, this sucks. that feeling of like, I don't have my stuff anymore. I'm never really a fan of that in any medium. So I used the example of video games. I don't really like it in books either. So that's a little frustrating, especially when you're like, what exactly is causing this? And on reread, I knew. So then it just felt like, can we get there already? But those are pretty small things. Those are just like the only things keeping this from being all time. And also, I didn't want to put too much in the top. I really wanted the top tier to be my absolute favorite. So that is why that one's in this second spot. Also, I'm going to go back to tier 4 and just say both Edge Dancer and Dawn Shard are here in this 4th tier. They're just not characters that I know as much about or care about as much. Lift is not my favorite character. I do find the things in Dawn Shard really interesting, similarly to how I described Emperor's Soul, where it feels like a crucial thing to read. For the Cosmere, the greater Cosmere, it just doesn't have as much to it in the way that I have come to expect and love. And I don't expect it to because it's so much shorter. So it's less that this one, it's not really a fault of the story or the writing. It's just that it's not a full-length novel for the most part. And it's not even a contained story. It's a piece of a bigger story. And it's just a piece that in isolation is not as impactful. I think it's very important to the greater whole, but that's really all I can say about those. They're Dawn Shard specifically, I definitely like more than Edge Dancer, though. I will say that. Back up to tier 2, we have The Final Empire and Warbreaker. Warbreaker, I almost put this in the 3rd tier because upon reread, it was not as exciting and fun as it was the first time around. I kind of went in depth in a separate video as to why, so I'll have that linked if you're interested. I still really love Warbreaker. It's still so colorful and vibrant, and the story is a lot of fun. The characters are a lot of fun, but it really is like, I almost wanted a tier to go between 2 and 3 because it probably would go in there, but I'm sort of combining this with my feelings of my first read and my feelings of my reread, and I'm just keeping it in this tier. It is a breath of fresh air, bad pun intended, in comparison to some of the doom and gloom and the devastation that we get in the others. And on that note, The Final Empire. The Final Empire, it's where it all begins with Mistborn. It's where, for a lot of us, our Cosmere journey began. And so it does have a special place in my heart for that reason. I love the getting to know Vin and Kelsier and the mentor-mentee relationship. I love just getting to know about Allomancy, your first meeting Sazed. You know, there's all these great things about the Final Empire, that feeling of hope and rebellion. That said, what made me love Mistborn first time, second time, third time I read it was never the first book. It's the second and third books. And while I like the Final Empire, I just don't think it's as good as the others in this series. So I love it, but it's not the Well of Ascension or the Hero of Ages. And on that note, the Well of Ascension and the Hero of Ages are in my top tier. That is probably not surprising to basically anybody, as Mistborn is still to this day one of my all-time favorite series. And I've read it 3 times now, and every single time I notice different things or different moments hit me in different ways. There are, of course, given that I've read it 3 times, moments that I'm like, you know, it would be nice if this scene would be over already. There's a specific plotline in book 3 that I think is most people's, it's like nobody's favorite, basically. So the Hero of Ages was a little bit more tedious to read, and it's so depressing. Well of Ascension, by far my favorite one to reread. I just love the politics of it. I know it's not for everybody, because if you don't like the politics, then it's your least favorite likely, but I love the politics of it. I really like Vin, her arc in that second book, and how she grows as a character, and how she comes to terms with who she is. I feel like it's very fitting for her age, and also where she is in the whole greater arc of the story, and just the devastation with, that's a key word apparently today in this video, but the devastation of the end. There's just so much that happens. There's a certain battle it's very vivid in my mind. I remember it vividly. I remember certain moments of that battle really vividly, the highs and the lows of that. So Well of Ascension is the one upon reread that definitely shot up to the top. I love it so much. Hero of Ages was my favorite the first time, but Well of Ascension, favorite of Mistborn era one, I should clarify. Well of Ascension, though, it's just so fun. Hero of Ages, it's just so sad. And when you know how everything comes together, there's like this sense of dread where you're like, no. But also it's great, and it's somewhat bittersweet, and it's amazing, and it's so like literally let's wait till the last minute before everything happens, and it will always hold a special place in my heart, and I don't think there's been too many other series that have ended in that way for me. Hero of Ages is just, it's still so good. Going to the bottom tier, I have two. One of them would be Secret History. This still remains one of my least favorite things in the Cosmere. For one specific scene, it's what I call the reunion scene, and I hate it. I hate it so much. I think it's corny. I think it goes so against the tone and the feeling of the Hero of Ages, and I can't stand it. I can't stand that one scene. I read it, and I'm like, this feels like, you know what? I'll just leave it at that. I can't stand it. I can't stand it. Now, other implications within Secret History are really cool, and what it means for the greater Cosmere is really interesting, but that scene, I hate. And then Sunlit Man is here at the bottom, because pretty much something else has to be. I don't hate any scene in Sunlit Man like I hated that scene in Secret History. It's just that Sunlit Man, to me, is never going to feel like it has a whole lot of impact without context. And we don't really have that context yet because it takes place so far after what we currently have. And I don't really know what the character's mourning. I don't really know what they're trying to overcome, what they're trying to process. And we can't know that, because if we do, it will be a reveal and a spoiler. So it had to be left ambiguous. This is one that I could see upon reread years later. Maybe will go up. But even like the side characters and the villain, they felt weaker to me as well. And the dialogue, I just didn't think it was as strong. So Sunlit Man is at the bottom. Going back to the top and ending it with Way of Kings and Rhythm of War. These are so good. Rereading Way of Kings, I'm just like, I love Kaladin. I love Kaladin so much. And I just love the beginning of the Stormlight Archive, and seeing, especially rereading it and seeing where everything has ended up and the arcs we get for the characters, to go back and see where they start. It just makes their arcs that much more impressive and impactful and meaningful. And I will just I don't think I'll ever get tired of Kaladin, and I don't think I'll ever get tired of the beginning of the story. It's so good. It's so hard hitting, and I love it so much. And that ending is so emotional. It's so good. And then Rhythm of War, it's like the mirror in my mind to Way of Kings. As I stated earlier, it's kind of like a resolution to an arc for one of our characters, and it's such a meaningful moment. So many moments that are just tear jerkers and lovely but sad, and some really big reveals and some really intense things happening that make you really nervous for the next book. I do agree that the backstory chapters in Rhythm of War are probably the weakest of all the backstory chapters in any of Stormlight. So that's true, but rereading it was probably my favorite Stormlight book to reread. I really found myself captivated by what was happening. I was still on edge. I still found myself mad when certain characters would say certain things, or specific family dynamics that were infuriating. And I was just as angry, if not more so. I really love that you actually find the stakes are, I wouldn't say they're smaller, but they're like on a smaller scale, even though the impact of them is catastrophic. But there is this sense of almost like intimacy with your heroes and your antagonists in this. And I don't know, I just really like how there's a plane, if you can hear it, it's very loud. I just really like the juxtaposition. Wow, it's so loud. I'm just gonna keep talking. I love the juxtaposition between it and Oathbringer, where Oathbringer got so big, and then I feel like we kind of dialed it in and made things personal again, which I really liked, even though it sounds really morbid. But that's it for tier ranking of the Cosmere, with having reread almost everything, and then also having these new books from the Year of Sanderson. I would love to know your rankings, and of course so many of us connect to Sanderson's works for different reasons, so I imagine so many of you really disagree about some of the placement of these, and I would love to know what is the thing that you disagree with the most, and then what is the thing that you feel you are exactly on the same page about, because I think it'd be kind of fun to see those extremes. But thanks so much for watching. I'm really excited now that I have finished my reread to do a lot more of Cosmere specific content leading up to Stormlight 5. I think that'll be a lot of fun. But thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.